Hello, everyone, and welcome to Part 5, Subpart 3 of Ancient Messages in Stone, Decoding the Assyrian Tree of Life. Up to this point in the video series, we have learned about the divine architecture of foundation with respect to the Tree of Life, the vertical plane of scale, the circular plane of scale, and their component designs of configuration and construction within the field. As we proceed with a review of concepts that we have learned thus far throughout this presentation, it is here in Part 5 that we will apply this knowledge in the unification of the fields and the unified fields of theory. Firstly, it is important to understand that the central column of the trunk or stalk of the pole ground is established as the center of the universe and represents the stabilizing jed for the celestial pole of the world pillar. As such, the world tree, or the tree of life, is central to the field and exists within each multi-layer of dimension within the field. Secondly, the world pillar and the world tree are established as a universal frame of context. Together, in their universal frame of reference, they are simply referred to as the tree of life, which exists within the universal dimension of perspective. The act of divining is specific to the tree of life itself, and in this instance, it is defined as the dividing of the tree of life into four separate branches. That is to say, that the dividing of the tree of life into four distinct branches is referred to as divining. That the act of divining is to divide the tree of life into separate parts, groups, categories, or branches. In the division of the tree of life, we can create four major branches that are defined and categorized by four separate frames of division. In its tree branching of duality, we can divide the right portion of the tree and define it as the right branch. We can divide the left portion of tree branching duality and define it as the left branch. We can divide the upper portion of the tree and define it as the upper branch. And finally, we can divide the lower portion of the tree and define it as the lower branch. Combined, this series of interlocking frames is referred to as the divine framework of field incorporation. With that said, we will now move forward with a review of concepts related to dividing the field of the plane. In the division of the field of the plane, we can create four major areas or groups of scale that are defined and categorized by four separate frames of division. We can divide the upper portion of the vertical plane and define it as the upper field. We can further define the upper area that lay outside the perimeter for the field of territorial boundary as the outfield. We can divide the lower portion of the vertical plane and define it as the lower field. We can further define the lower area that lay outside the perimeter for the field of territorial boundary as the infield. We can divide the right portion of the vertical plane and define it as the right field. And finally, we can divide the left portion of the vertical plane and define it as the left field. Combined, This series of interlocking frames is referred to as the divine framework of field division for the plane. With that said, we will now move forward with a review of concepts related to dividing the field of the sphere. In the division of the field of the sphere, we can create four major areas or groups of scale that are defined and categorized by four separate frames of division. We'll begin by dividing the right portion of the circular plane and define it as the eastern hemisphere and the right hemisphere. We can divide the left portion of the circular plane and define it as the western hemisphere and the left hemisphere. We can divide the upper portion of the circular plane and define it as the northern hemisphere. And finally, we can divide the lower portion of the circular plane and define it as the southern hemisphere. Having divided the field of the sphere, the resultant series of interlocking frames is defined as the divine framework of field division for the sphere. With that said, we will now move forward in our study and understanding of concepts related to the unification of the fields. Now that we have accomplished division within both the field of the plane and the field of the sphere, our objective will be to combine them together as one so that their component architecture and fields of division present as a single body of formation within the field. So let's take a look at our first example of the unified field of the orbital plane, where both the vertical and circular planes of scale have been combined. The unification of both the field of the plane and the field of the sphere results in what is referred to as the universal manifold of the orbital mainframe. We can take a look at our second example, wherein the unified fields of the orbital plane have been populated with their numerical scales. In order to establish a connection between the field of the plane and the field of the sphere, we will use the divine framework of field division for the plane and combine it with the divine framework of field division for the sphere. As a result, you can see that the labels used to define each area or group of division for both the field of the plane and the field of the sphere have merged. The resulting matrix for this grid of interconnected frames is referred to as the divine framework of field division for the whole. When looking at the matrix of interconnected frames, there is the formation of a grid-like structure within the central area of their combined grouping. The two vertical lines bridging the frames for both the right and left portion of the unified fields are defined as the north-south connectors. The two horizontal lines bridging the frames for both the upper and lower portion of the unified fields are defined as the east-west connectors. The insertion of these directional connectors completes and closes the circuitry of divisional frames within the field and forms a bridge of connection for the central axis of minor conjunction. The panel, or circuit board of directional coordinate, were configured in its creation as the gatekeeper for the inner core of the tree of life. Having established a connection between the field of the plane and the field of the sphere, and merging their frameworks of field division, we can now complete the network of circuitry by connecting the unified field of interlocking frames to the foundation of the tree of life. As you can see, this series of interlocking frames that results in the divine framework of field incorporation upon the tree of life is the foundation of interface upon which the unified field of interlocking frames connects to, thus completing the circuit in the unification of the fields in their unified fields of theory. With that said, we will now move forward in our study and understanding of dimensions of perspective, frames of context, and frames of reference, which separate and define each dimension one from another. To begin, what we have before us is a stone tablet of ancient origin. This stone tablet is referred to as a petroglyph, whose surface of raised images contain multi-layered messages and concepts that have been carved and engraved within multiple dimensions of perspective, meaning that the eye of the beholder has the interactive ability to interpret various messages, concepts, and their meanings, depending upon the dimension of perspective from which the tablet is being viewed. It is within these multi-layered dimensions of perspective that frames of context or frames of reference exist, which separate and define each dimension one from another. When we look upon the whole of this particular stone tablet, understand that it is representative of the universal foundation and is established as the first frame of context. In its first frame of reference, it is referred to as the field of the whole, the all, and the oneness. Understand that the total surface area of the stone tablet is representative of the first dimension of perspective. And it is from this first dimension of perspective that the petroglyph of this stone tablet can be viewed as the in the beginning, that is, the before the going forth of the all. As it relates to the multi-layered perspective of the field, it is the first dimension of perspective that is established as the unified field. Within the field of the whole, the all, and the oneness, we can further establish the second frame of context and define it as the four corners of the universe. As a result, we have created the second frame of reference that is referred to as the perimeter for the field of territorial boundary. The area or space that lay within the perimeter is referred to as the second dimension of perspective. It is from this perspective that the petroglyph of this stone tablet can be viewed as the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Good and Evil, the orchard, the vineyard, the floral meadow of the valley landscape, the valley landscape of the soul, and the mind field. As it relates to the multi-layered perspective of the field, it is the second dimension of perspective that is established as the field of incorporation. Within the field of incorporation, we can further establish the third frame of context as the orbital plane of the spheres, whose series of orbital frames are configured upon the vertical plane of scale as well as the circular plane of scale. In its third frame of reference, it is referred to as the divine framework of the universal construct, which is comprised of both the divine framework of the orbital spheres and the divine framework of the wheel of life. As it relates to the multi-layered perspective of the field, it is the third dimension of perspective that is established as the divine construct of the universal foundation. Previously in Part 5, Subpart 2, we removed component architecture related to the divine cross, the mundane cross, and the compass in order to better accomplish the act of division for the field of the sphere. Each of these components will now be reincorporated within the structure of the universal foundation. With that said, it is throughout this video series that we have learned about frames of context, frames of reference, and multi-layered dimensions of perspective. As it relates to the third eye of perspective, we have viewed the tree of life from symbolic, historical, biblical, musical, mechanical, engineering, and architectural perspectives. As the tree of life is the foundational structure upon which everything exists, we have one final frame of context and one final frame of reference to populate within the field. A planetary frame of context and a planetary frame of reference that can be referred to as the 3D experience machine. Let us now go to BibleGateway.com and reference biblical scripture that speaks to the many folds of dimension and the many layers of perspective that exist within divine creation. From the King James Bible, the Book of Psalms, chapter 104, verse 24, it states, O Lord, how manifold are thy works! In wisdom thou hast made them all. The earth is full of thy riches. From the King James Bible, the Book of Psalms, chapter 104, verse 24, it states, O Lord, how manifold are thy works! In wisdom thou hast made them all. The earth is full of thy riches. Well, that's it for this video. Please be sure to like, share, subscribe, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to be notified when we post new videos. Until next time.